The smell hit you before anything else. Wood smoke and lamp oil, and the faint, persistent sweetness of bread that had been baked here so many times the walls had absorbed it. The room was not large. Perhaps 6 meters across, perhaps 8. The floor was packed earth, smooth from years of bare feet. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man had to watch his head near the beams. There were no windows on the street side, only a single oil lamp throwing more shadow than light, and the people pressed together in the warmth of their own bodies, because the night outside was cold and the door was shut, and what was happening in this room wasn't something you wanted the neighbors to understand. This was not a church, not the way you are picturing it, not the soaring nave, not the stone columns, not the gold leaf catching candlelight in a vaulted ceiling. No choir, no pews, no bell tower calling the city to worship. Just a room, a family's room, someone's dining room, someone's sleeping room, someone's storage room cleared out and made holy by the people gathered inside it. The year was somewhere around 57 A.D., and the congregation meeting in this house in Corinth was perhaps 30 people, perhaps 40, pressed together on benches and floor mats and window sills, listening to a letter being read aloud. The letter had traveled weeks to reach them. It had been written by a man they had never met in person, a former tent maker who was currently under house arrest somewhere in Rome, and the letter was telling them, among other things, that they were doing church wrong. This is the story of how the first Christians built their faith. Not in stone, not in grandeur, not in the architectural vocabulary of empire, but in the most ordinary spaces human beings have ever occupied: kitchens, courtyards, workshops, borrowed rooms, and how, over 3 centuries, those spaces transformed into the most ambitious building program the ancient world had ever seen. What changed? Why it changed? And what a single Greek word buried in the New Testament reveals about everything that transformation cost. The word is ekklesia, and it does not mean what most people think it means. But that comes later. First, we need to understand what the first Christians were actually doing, and where they were actually doing it. Forget the image of the early church as a secret society huddled in Roman catacombs. That image is almost entirely wrong. The catacombs were burial sites, not meeting places. Christians visited them to honor their dead, not to hold weekly gatherings. The actual meeting spaces of the first Christian communities were far more ordinary, far more domestic, and far more theologically significant than any underground tunnel. The technical term scholars use is domus ecclesiae, the house church. And in the last 40 years, archaeology has given us something extraordinary. We can actually see one. In the ancient Syrian city of Dura-Europos, on the western bank of the Euphrates River, excavations beginning in 1928 and continuing through the 1930s under the joint direction of Yale University and the French Academy of Inscriptions uncovered a structure that stopped the archaeological world cold. It was a private house, a standard Roman-era courtyard home, dating to approximately 232 A.D. But someone had modified it. 2 rooms on the east side had been knocked together to create a single larger space capable of holding perhaps 70 people. A small room at the north end had been fitted with a raised platform and a basin, almost certainly a baptistery, its walls covered in some of the oldest surviving Christian paintings in the world. A shepherd carrying a sheep on his shoulders, a woman approaching a tomb in pre-dawn darkness, a paralyzed man carrying his mat. This was a church, not built as a church, converted into one, a family home remade for a community. And this was not exceptional. This was the norm. The New Testament itself is a directory of house churches if you know how to read it. Paul's letter to the Romans greets the congregation meeting in the house of Prisca and Aquila. His letter to the Colossians greets the church in the house of Nympha. Philemon receives a letter addressed to himself, to Apphia, to Archippus, and to the church in your house. The Acts of the Apostles describes the first Jerusalem Christians meeting daily in the temple courts. Yes, but also breaking bread from house to house. The Greek phrase is kat oikon, house by house. The architecture of the first church was the architecture of the family. Picture what this meant in practice. A first-century Roman house in a city like Corinth or Ephesus or Antioch was organized around a central courtyard open to the sky. The rooms surrounding it served multiple purposes simultaneously. The triclinium, the dining room, was the largest and most important space, designed for reclining couches arranged around a central table where the family would eat. This was also the room where the congregation would gather, where the Lord's Supper would be observed, where the letters would be read aloud. The atrium, the entrance hall, might hold overflow. The courtyard itself could accommodate more in good weather. A wealthy household with a large triclinium might seat 30 people reclining in the Roman style. 60 if they sat. The community grew. You met in shifts, or you found a larger house, or you met in multiple houses across the city simultaneously, which is almost certainly what the Corinthian church was doing when Paul wrote to correct their divisions. The host of the house church was not simply providing a venue. In a world organized entirely around patron-client relationships, the householder who opened their home was the patron of the community. They provided the space, the oil for the lamps, the bread and wine for the meal, the social protection that came from having a named, respectable address. The congregation was, in a very real sense, their household. And this created the tensions Paul spent enormous energy trying to untangle, because the wealthy patron who expected the best couch and the first portion of the meal was being told that in this particular gathering, the last would be first, and the slave sitting on the floor was the brother of the senator reclining at the table. The house church was not just a practical arrangement. It was a theological statement that kept colliding with the social reality of the Roman world. This is what few people understand about the first 3 centuries of Christian worship. The Christians had no dedicated buildings, not because they were hiding, and not because they were poor, though many were, but because the faith had not yet generated the institutional infrastructure that produces buildings. There was no central authority commissioning construction. There was no real estate portfolio, no building fund, no bishop with a mandate to erect a cathedral. There were networks of communities, each meeting in the most available space, each shaped by the particular social world of its host. The Roman Empire, for its part, did not initially know what to do with these gatherings. They were not a collegium, one of the licensed burial societies or trade guilds that were permitted to meet under Roman law. They were not a synagogue, though they shared many features with Jewish communal worship. They occupied a legal gray zone that made them intermittently vulnerable to the suspicion and violence of local authorities, which is precisely why meeting in a private home was not only convenient but protective. A private dinner party was nobody's business. A public assembly was. This is the world that produced the first Christian architecture. Not ambition, not wealth, not the desire to impress. Necessity, intimacy, and the particular genius of a faith that had decided from its very first gathering in an upper room in Jerusalem that the sacred could happen anywhere 2 or 3 were gathered together. Move forward. The year is 312 AD, and everything is about to change. On the night before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, a Roman general named Constantine looked at the sky and saw something. What exactly he saw has been debated for 17 centuries. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who knew Constantine personally and wrote his biography, says it was a vision of a cross of light above the sun, with the words in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer. Lactantius, writing closer to the event, describes a dream in which Constantine was instructed to mark his soldiers' shields with the chiro, the first two letters of the Greek word Christos. Whether vision or dream or political calculation dressed in divine language, the effect was the same. Constantine won the battle. He became emperor, and within a year he had issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians throughout the empire freedom of worship and ordering the return of confiscated church property. For the first time in 3 centuries, Christians could build. Not just could, were invited to, were funded to, were commanded to. Constantine himself became the first great patron of Christian architecture, and he approached the project with the energy and ambition of a man who understood that buildings were theology made permanent. He did not, however, invent a new architectural form. He borrowed one. And the building he borrowed from was not a temple. Here is what changes everything about early Christian architecture. The Romans had temples, magnificent ones, with columns and pediments and sacred interiors where the divine image resided. But the temple interior was not a gathering space. It was the God's house, accessible only to priests. The congregation stood outside. The sacrifice happened in the open air. If Constantine had wanted to build Christian worship spaces on the model of Roman temples, he would have produced buildings entirely unsuitable for what Christians actually did, which was gather, sing, read, preach, eat, and pray together in large numbers. So he turned instead to the basilica. The basilica was a Roman civic building, a multi-purpose hall used for law courts, commercial transactions, and public assemblies. It was not sacred, it was functional. Its design was elegant in its simplicity. A long rectangular hall, the nave, flanked by lower side aisles separated by rows of columns, with a semicircular apse at one end where the judge or magistrate would sit. It was designed to hold crowds. It was designed for speaking and listening. It was designed, in other words, for exactly what Christian worship required. The first great Constantinian basilicas rose in Rome and Jerusalem simultaneously, and their scale was intended to announce something. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, begun around 313 AD and still standing today as the Cathedral of Rome, was approximately 100 meters long and 55 meters wide. Its nave ceiling rose to 35 meters. It could hold several thousand people. This was not a house church. This was not a converted dining room. This was a building that said, in stone and mortar and gilded ceiling panels, that the faith which had met in kitchens for 3 centuries was now the faith of empire. In Jerusalem, Constantine commissioned a structure over the site identified as the Tomb of Jesus. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, begun around 326 AD under the direction of Constantine's mother Helena, combined a basilica with a rotunda enclosing the tomb itself, a new architectural form for a new theological claim. The resurrection had happened in a specific place, and that place was now the center of the world. The building program was staggering. Within a generation, the landscape of the Roman world was being physically remade. Bethlehem received a basilica over the cave of the Nativity. The Mount of Olives received a basilica marking the Ascension. The Jordan River, the sites of miracles, the graves of martyrs, all of them acquired stone structures marking the intersection of the eternal and the historical. And this is where we need to stop and ask a question that the early Christians themselves were asking, loudly and with considerable anxiety. What does a building do to a faith? The Greek word ekklesia, the word translated as church in your New Testament, did not originally mean a building. It did not mean a religious institution. It did not mean a denomination or a tradition or a style of worship. The word comes from two Greek roots, ek, meaning out of, and kaleo, meaning to call. The ekklesia was the called-out assembly. In classical Greek usage before Christianity adopted it, the ekklesia was the civic assembly of free citizens called out of their homes to gather and make decisions together. It was not a place. It was a people in motion, people who had been called out of wherever they were and gathered together for a purpose. Paul uses this word 114 times in his letters. He never uses it to mean a building. He never uses it to mean a location. He uses it to mean the gathered people of God, the community of those who have been called out and called together. When he writes to the church in Corinth, he is not writing to an address. He is writing to a body of people who happen to be meeting in someone's house, because that is what called-out people do. They gather wherever they can. The theological weight of this matters enormously when you watch what happens in the 4th century, because the moment Christians began building dedicated worship spaces, they began doing something the word itself resisted. They began locating the ekklesia in a place. The called-out assembly became the building you went into rather than the people you went with. The church became an address. This was not entirely wrong. The buildings were extraordinary acts of theological imagination. The basilica's long nave pointing toward the apse became a spatial metaphor for the journey of the soul toward God. The light falling through high, clear-story windows became a physical experience of divine illumination. The mosaic programs covering the walls, the gold tessera catching lamplight, the procession of saints and prophets lining the nave, these were not decoration. They were catechesis. In a world where most people could not read, the building itself was the text. You walked into the story. You stood inside the theology. The architects and bishops who designed these spaces understood what they were doing. The baptistery, always a separate building in the early period, was deliberately designed as an octagon. 8 sides, because 8 in early Christian numerology meant the first day of the new creation, the day beyond the 7 days of the old world. You entered through death and came out into a new week, a new existence, a new octagonal room that said with its very geometry, you are no longer who you were. The apse mosaic above the altar showed Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by apostles, and the congregation standing before it was not watching a performance. They were being told where they were standing in the cosmic order. They were standing at the edge of eternity, looking in. But something was also being lost, and the voices that said so were not silent. The theologian Origen, writing in the 3rd century before the Constantinian transformation, had been emphatic. God does not live in buildings made by human hands. The sacred is not located. It is present wherever the community gathers in truth and love. The earliest Christian apologists had made this their boast against pagan critics who mocked Christianity for having no temples. We have no temples because we need none. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. The community is the building. By the 5th century, that boast had become impossible to make with a straight face. The Christians had more temples than anyone. The trajectory did not stop with the basilica. It accelerated. As the Roman Empire in the West fragmented under the pressure of migration and military collapse, the Church became the primary institutional continuity in a world where civic order was dissolving. The bishop's basilica was no longer just a worship space. It was the courthouse, the granary, the hospital, the school, the refugee center. The building had to grow to hold all of it. And as the church's wealth and political authority grew through the early medieval period, the architecture grew with it, each generation of builders adding height, adding complexity, adding light. The Romanesque style, emerging in the 9th and 10th centuries, took the basilica's basic bones and thickened them. Massive stone walls, round arches, small windows, because the engineering of the time could not yet pierce large openings in load-bearing walls without risking collapse. These buildings were fortresses of faith, their weight and solidity a physical argument for permanence in an age of violence and uncertainty. The pilgrimage churches of Spain and southern France, Santiago de Compostela, Vézelay, Conques, grew along the pilgrimage routes to accommodate the extraordinary crowds of believers walking hundreds of miles to touch the bones of saints. The architecture had to solve a new problem. How do you move thousands of people through a sacred space without disrupting the liturgy? The answer was the ambulatory, a walkway circling behind the altar, allowing pilgrims to process around the shrine, while Mass continued uninterrupted. The faith's geography was shaping the building's geometry. And then, in the Île-de-France in the 12th century, something happened that no one had quite managed before. The Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, a small man of enormous intellectual ambition who had been running the royal abbey north of Paris since 1122, decided that the existing church was inadequate. Not in size, though it was too small for the crowds. Inadequate theologically, inadequate philosophically. He had been reading the writings of a 5th century mystic known as Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, who argued that divine light was the primary medium through which the human soul ascended toward God. Material light, physical light, the actual photons bouncing off gold and glass and white stone, was a participation in the uncreated light of the divine nature. To bathe a worshipper in light was to bathe them in God. Suger wanted to build that. The engineering problem was this: light required windows, windows required openings in walls, and openings in walls weakened the structure. The Romanesque solution was to keep windows small and walls thick, but a new structural innovation was making something else possible. The pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic architecture filtering through Sicily and Spain, distributed weight more efficiently than the round arch, allowing walls to be taller and thinner. The flying buttress, an external stone arm reaching from a freestanding pier to the upper wall, transferred the lateral thrust of the vault outside the building entirely, freeing the wall from its structural burden. A wall that did not have to hold up the roof could be opened, almost entirely opened, almost entirely replaced with glass. The choir of Saint-Denis, completed in 1144, was the first Gothic building. Suger described it himself in his account of the construction, and his language is the language of a man who believed he had solved a theological problem with an architectural solution. The entire sanctuary is pervaded by a wonderful and continuous light entering through the most sacred windows. The windows themselves were not transparent. They were narrative. Colored glass in reds and blues and greens and yellows told the stories of Scripture and the lives of saints in panels 10 meters high, the light filtering through them staining the stone floor and the faces of the congregation in shifting color as the sun moved. You did not read these windows. You were read by them. The light passed through the story and landed on you. Within a generation, the Gothic style had spread across northern Europe with the speed of an idea whose time had come. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Notre-Dame de Paris, each one taller, lighter, more technically audacious than the last, each one a 3-century argument in stone and glass that the faith which had begun in a borrowed dining room in Corinth had arrived at the center of civilization and intended to stay. The tallest Gothic nave ever completed was at Beauvais Cathedral in northern France. Its choir, finished in 1272, rose to 48 meters, nearly the height of a 16-story building. It collapsed in 1284. They rebuilt it. It collapsed again in 1573. The transepts were never completed. The building stands today, unfinished and magnificent, a monument to the precise point where human ambition and structural physics disagreed. There is something in that image worth sitting with. The house in Corinth, where 30 people pressed together to hear Paul's letter, read aloud, 6 meters by 8. The nave of Beauvais Cathedral, 48 meters high, the sky made of colored glass, the stone so thin it trembled in high winds. Between those two spaces stretched 12 centuries of human longing, institutional power, theological argument, engineering genius, and the persistent, aching human desire to make the invisible visible, to build a container worthy of the God who, according to the faith being practiced in both spaces, had chosen to be born in a feeding trough in a cave outside a village of 400 people. The tension never resolved. It was never supposed to. Because here is what the entire arc of Christian architecture keeps saying, from the house church to the Gothic cathedral, from the packed earth floor to the 48-meter vault. The building is always trying to say something that buildings cannot quite say. The house church said, God is here, in the ordinary, in the domestic, in the shared meal and the borrowed room, and the people pressed together in the dark. The cathedral said, God is transcendent, infinite, beyond all human making, and we will spend every resource we have trying to gesture toward that infinity in stone and light and height. Both of them were right. Both of them were incomplete. And the faith kept building, kept gathering, kept pressing the architecture to hold more than architecture can hold, because the thing being worshipped was always larger than the space being built. The ekklesia was never the building. It was always the people, the called-out ones, the gathered ones, the ones pressing together in the warmth of their own bodies in a borrowed room with a packed earth floor and a single oil lamp, listening to a letter from a man they had never met, being told that they were the body of Christ, that they were the temple of the Holy Spirit, that the sacred was not in the marble and the gold, but in them, in the community itself, in the love between the senator and the slave sharing the same bread at the same table. Every cathedral in the world is a footnote to that room. And the question the architecture keeps asking, the question Suger was asking when he filled his walls with light, the question the unknown builder was asking when he knocked 2 rooms together in Dura-Europos and painted a shepherd on the wall, the question you are asking right now, whether you know it or not, is the same question the first Christians were asking in that house in Corinth, with the door shut and the lamp burning low. Where is God? How do we get close? What kind of space can hold this? The answer the faith kept giving, in every century and every architectural style, was not a place. It was a practice. Gather, eat together, read the words aloud, let the light in, make room for the stranger. The building is not the church. The building is the invitation. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who has ever sat in a cathedral and felt small, or sat in a living room and felt held, because both of those experiences are the same experience wearing different clothes. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the spaces where history and faith intersect, and leave a comment telling us, where have you felt most like the ekklesia, the called-out, gathered people? In the grandest building you have ever entered? or in the most ordinary